Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi, to what's going to be a Dendro review video. So, right before the patch for 3.0, I put out a few videos where I talked about what I would expect to be good and all that. But I haven't really revisited the subject, like looking at all of Dendro, what's good, what's bad, the kind of mechanics you can go for, the kind of team archetypes that you can do since Dendro came out. I'd say that at this point, I've got a pretty solid understanding of basically all the Dendro-like archetypes and mechanics. Arguably the only archetype that I haven't really explored much is pure Burgeon teams, but the main reason why I haven't explored it is because I don't think it's all that good. I think it has a lot of shortcomings with the current units available to us. That being said, we can get right into it. Now, I'm gonna go get the complete Dendro teams prep guide. And welcome. We're basically doing an update to this and basically changing it to look at what things are like now. So we've got Quicken / Aggravate. Then for the Bloom reactions, you've got QuickBloom, traditional Hyperbloom, Anemo, Hyperbloom. For Burgeon, traditional Burgeon, Electro Burgeon, Anemo Burgeon, and then you've got Fridge, and then more specifically, like in each of those teams, the kind of stuff you want to be going for. I think we're going to start with QuickBloom because I think QuickBloom is probably the one on which I was the most off. And it's not that I was wrong on the mechanic, it's just that I overestimated how valuable it was. By the way, QuickBloom is basically the idea of using a Hydro unit with relatively slow Hydro application in order to keep Quicken uptime on the enemy, because when you trigger Quicken, you have a Dendro aura on the enemy, and that lets you aggravate. It's not a Dendro aura, it's a Quicken aura. However, if you trigger Quicken and then you remove that Dendro, which is Quicken, this doesn't aggravate. We got a Hyperbloom because we generated some seeds, but it doesn't aggravate. So that aura can sustain generally 2 Bloom reactions. So if you have slow Hydro application, you can actually get away with a Hydro unit without actually removing your Quicken aura. And that's where the Quick Bloom teams come in. But yeah, and as you can see, we don't actually lose our Quicken aura, so we can keep the enemy quickened the whole time. Now, obviously, my characters aren't built properly. Don't take out how fast I'm clearing this as like the barometer for how good it is. The biggest problem for QuickBloom teams is that, by definition, because we don't have fast Dendro application, you don't have a way of applying a lot of Hydro. Because if you apply a lot of Hydro, you lose your Quicken, and it's not a QuickBloom team anymore. And so, because of that, at that point, why have a Hydro unit at all? The amount of Cs you can generate is just not enough to justify the slot, because our Dendro application is slow. Once we get faster Dendro application, it is very possible that instead of using Barbara, you can use someone like Yelan, and you can still maintain the Quicken aura, and then at that point, you're gonna get you're using a unit that's better, but also you're applying more Hydro, and because you have this potential like faster Dendro, it doesn't make you lose your Quicken, and that would be a pretty big deal. It would let you basically generate more seeds without losing Quicken. As of right now, with the Dendro units we have, it's not generally something I'd really recommend. There are QuickBloom teams that are good, which are basically just the Technati teams, and it's not really because it's QuickBloom that's good, it's just that you're kind of playing Hyperbloom with Technati, but because he has very front-loaded fast Dendro application, you'll get Quicken uptime anyways. In these teams, you want your trigger, right, your character who's triggering the Hyperblooms, to be level 90 and have a decent amount of EM. They're also triggering Quicken, so I mean, that's nice. You want to make sure you meet all your ER requirements. Your Hydro character doesn't need to have any specific stats for the reaction, so you just build them like you usually do. In this case, I'm using Beto because Beto's burst, as you can see, it's active, it is hitting the enemy, but it's not actually hitting the seeds. Because she doesn't hit the seeds, you can actually put her on your team and take advantage of the Quicken without sharing your Hyperbloom between 2 characters, which is nice. This kind of team in general is like, nah. Not the best because you're limiting yourself too much in terms of, if you want to keep your Quicken uptime, because our Dendro application is so slow, you can't go for a lot of the Hydro characters that you would want to go for. And because you're not getting that many seeds, you're just not getting that much out of it anyways. Next up, let's talk about just the normal Quicken teams. These teams are very strong. It's the Electro one, so it's definitely not going to be like as good as it otherwise could be, but want to kill him. I don't want to. I think he might be dead. He's not dead. Let's go. Anyways, these teams are like solid. One of the very important things that I talked about in the Dendro pre-release video was Fischl's Ascension 4. This passive right here. If your current active character triggers an electro-related elemental reaction when Oz is on the field, the opponent shall be stricken with the Thundering Retribution, dealing electro damage equal to 80% of Fischl's attack. And just like I expected, this is very, very, very strong. But the baseline aggravate numbers are for about... The baseline numbers are about 10k. When I aggravate, it's like 19k, which is cool. But also... Right? Every time I'll trigger an on-field reaction, I'll have Oz do that joint attack, and that joint attack will also trigger aggravate. And if I go, for example, I'll remove the stuff on my Katsing, just so you can see that like the numbers that are big are not Katsings, they're Fischl's. And obviously Katsing is doing like she's doing her part in this team. I just want to show that Fischl is actually getting something like pretty relevant. Right, you see all these 10Ks? Or maybe not all of them, but a pretty decent amount of them. That's Fischl doing Fischl things. Without Fischl, this is what we do. So all of the difference between what I'm doing right now and what I was doing when I used Fischl Oz, that's Fischl's damage, basically. In single target situations, Fischl provides an insane amount of damage for your aggravate teams. Enough to basically almost single-handedly carry most aggravate teams' single target damage. Because of that, it lets you run on-fielders that are more focused on AoE. Someone like Katsing, someone like Raiden. You can also use someone like Yaemiko, who's a decent mix of single target and AoE. The main downside of using Fischl is that you really, really want to have an Electro unit on field. You really, really want to have an Anemo unit, and you need a Dendro unit. But your Anemo units, you kind of want it to be someone who groups and or has buffs, which means you don't have options for healer slots, right? That's the biggest issue with a lot of the official teams, is that they don't have that many good options for healer slots. So if you want to use a healer slot, you can actually, instead of using Katsing, you can use someone like Cookie. And you can treat it more like a quick swap team where you spend some time on Cookie, some time on Kazuha, some time on Fischl, than just like a true like carry team with an on-fielder and some off-fielders. Your Fischl Oz has a 25-second cooldown. Your Katsing Q has a 12-second cooldown, so you can use 2 in 25 seconds if you do it like that. But yeah. Another thing that you can do is you can use a different unit as your on-fielder. Now, Spread does not trigger Fischl's Ascension 4, but Quicken does. So if you've got a Dendro unit that applies like a decent amount of Dendro but won't overtake, you could on-field them. Right now, we don't have that. But one thing that we can do is we can use someone like Sucrose as an on-fielder. And then that lets you, on your last slot, use someone like Beto, someone like Yai, someone like Cookie. And as you can see, even though this is a team that focuses a lot more on AoE than single target, right? With Beto, with Sucrose being on field and being able to group the enemies pretty reliably, we still get pretty solid single target damage. And that's basically all just Fischl synergizing with Sucrose. Because when you have your Oz down and you're auto-attacking with Sucrose, every time you swirl with your normal attacks, you'll trigger Fischl's Ascension 4. And in aggravate teams, that matters a lot because her Ascension 4 will always aggravate. So, in your Quicken and aggravate teams, you're going to absolutely want all of your units to be level 90. The ones that don't do a lot of damage and that kind of suck, like for example, Dendro MC. In aggravate teams, Dendro MC is basically just applying Dendro and then swapping out. They don't actually apply Dendro often enough to do a lot of damage with it. It's not the end of the world if they're not level 90, but generally your Fischl really, really wants to be level 90 because aggravate damage scales with levels really well. Your Anemo unit, your other Electro unit generally, but yeah. You have a lot of options for aggravate. There's basically like most of the Electro units are usable in aggravate and they're to some extent pretty decent. the better they can drive Fischl, the more you can make up for a like lackluster kit. So for example, someone like Lisa, who isn't that great in general, but has electro normal attacks and has a burst that deals electro damage over time, can drive Fischl fine, and because of that, it kind of makes up for her somewhat lackluster kit. But yeah, I guess some more aggravated stuff that I haven't talked about much is the Thundering Fury Kazuha stuff. I love it. It's really fun. It's about as good as I expected it to be. It doesn't perform the best in single target because with Kole, who happens, and with Dendro MC, but you'll often end up fucking over your Electro app on the enemies in a way that sometimes you just don't get Electro Swirls, and when you don't get Electro Swirl, you don't trigger Fischl A4, and when you don't trigger Fischl A4, you cry. Now, obviously, this is a team that focuses mostly on stuff like 12-1 first half, right? So it's gonna be in its element, inside of its niche. Right, so you've got this. Unfortunately, they died a little bit too fast here. Oops. So they didn't do all the stuff that they're supposed to do. Yee! Well, whatever. That can be this team's biggest issue, is that you kill the waves too fast, and then the second wave doesn't have Dendro on them, so you don't trigger Quicken anymore. There we go. You get the idea though, right? Team that's really, really good against content like that because it's basically just a venti team with Kazuha, so you get like incredibly good grouping. But it also performs like somewhat okay against ungroupable enemies, against stuff like single target. It's obviously a lot worse, but because you got your Fischl, you can still kind of get carried. But yeah, you get the idea, like, even if it's like mainly an AoE team, in single target, you basically get carried by Fischl, and in AoE, you've got your Kazuha and Venti to do the job. This is probably my favorite Quicken team. It's very fun, but it's not like, it's far from the only good one. Quicken is just, it has a lot of good teams. When you look at like what's really good for Quicken teams, you also have some like Quick Swap, Technari, Yaimiko, Fischl, Kazuha teams that perform really well. One thing that I talked about in the first video was Kazuha versus Sucrose in Quicken teams, and basically I talked about how Kazuha will always be better, and I do stand by that, but I'd say that overall, specifically in Quicken teams that don't need someone to be on field, so like where you don't just auto attack with Sucrose, Kazuha will generally be slightly better just because he gets a lot of personal damage from the aggravated swirls in AoE. In single target, it's kind of more to Sucrose's benefit because Sucrose buffs your team by more, right? She just does. Especially if you give her a Hakushin, you got Constellations on her, like, she buffs your team by a lot. It's just her personal damage will generally be weaker. When you're in AoE, you get all the personal damage, but when you're in single target, you don't get AoE swirls and you don't get aggravated swirls, which means that Kazuha's damage takes a nosedive. Sucrose's as well, but basically because Sucrose is at a baseline, more focused on buffing your team than personal damage, then losing that personal damage doesn't hurt her as much as it hurts Kazuha. So let's get into the more fun stuff. I guess we can start with just straight up Fridge, because straight up Fridge kind of sucks. Fridge is basically a mechanic by which you use a Cryo Aura in order to have your Dendro let you generate more seeds. So when you use Dendro into Hydro, right, you can generate 2 seeds with 1 Dendro application. However, if you add some Cryo in the mix, you can potentially actually get more seeds. See how I got 3 seeds here? The way that it works is Hydro, when coming into contact with an enemy, will, if they have an element on them, trigger an elemental reaction. But Cryo and Dendro can coexist at the same time on an enemy without triggering a reaction. So when you apply Hydro, the first thing that it does is react with the first element. And the first element for a Hydro onto those two is going to be Cryo. Which means that in order to actually get to the Dendro aura, you have to first remove all the Cryo. Because of that, if you apply a larger amount of Cryo, and then you only apply Hydro one time, right? If I do something like this, into this, into this, I'll trigger Frozen, but I won't trigger Bloom. And now that the Cryo is gone, if I attack again, I will trigger Bloom. You have to go through all of the Cryo in order to trigger the Bloom reaction with Dendro. But the part of your Hydro that actually gets through to the Dendro is only what went through the Cryo, which means that if you have a decent amount of Cryo when you apply Hydro, effectively, you're still triggering your Bloom, but you're removing less Dendro from the enemy, right? You're using your Cryo, your Cold, to make your Dendro, your Lettuce, last longer, right? Kind of like a Fridge does, hence the Fridge name. The biggest issue with Fridge right now is basically just that we don't have good Bloom units. We don't have a lot of synergy with Bloom stuff. Our Dendro application is really slow, which means that we don't have a lot of good ways to maintain Dendro aura. In order to do it, you kind of have to go with a Cryo unit. So you have to go with a Hydro unit that doesn't apply that much Hydro. Then you gotta get a healer in your team. And then, I mean, you also gotta get a grouper ideally, because Bloom teams are a lot better in AoE than they are in single target. And if you don't have a grouper, then that kind of sucks. It's unfortunate. Point being, Fridge is a bit underwhelming just because Bloom in general is a bit underwhelming. Now, obviously, you can play Bloom teams with Nilo, which I haven't talked about in the pre-release because we didn't have any information on Nilo. But you can't play Fridge with Nilo because if you put a power unit on your team, you lose her passives. That being said, you can actually use the Fridge mechanic just to generate more seeds in teams that aren't just Bloom teams. So, let's talk about HyperFridge. In HyperFridge, you are using the Fridge mechanic, the applying Cryo to get more seeds, except instead of just letting your Blooms explode, you play with an Electro unit and use Hyperbloom. The reason why you might want to do that is because, well, obviously your Cryo unit lets you generate more seeds, but it means you can freeze, which can be nice for defensive utility. Your Cryo units, as of right now at least, are a lot stronger as a baseline than your Dendro units. So if your objective is to generate more seeds, it would be generally better to do it by adding a Cryo unit to your team who can actually do something on their own on top of helping you generate more seeds. Anyways, what you end up doing, something like this. Basically, you just end up using the Fridge to generate a few more seeds. And it's cool. It's nice. It's cool. Get it? Because it's a Fridge. Cool it! Dodge this! It's not necessarily like an incredible amount more Blooms, but being able to run freeze on your Bloom team is always just nice, right? It's comfortable. But yeah, so HyperFridge is something that I didn't talk about in the pre-release because I didn't really think about it. And it's definitely something that has pleasantly surprised me. It does feel like your Cryo unit is doing something to help your team, but then on top of that, you're also just getting freeze. Now, the reason why we can actually get freeze when it comes to, well, freezable enemies that aren't just bosses, is because a unit like Raiden will hit with Electro relatively quickly, about once a second, but because of their internal cooldown, will only apply Electro relatively slowly, so it won't interfere too much with you getting freeze, but it will Hyperbloom the seeds. So if you go do it against a freezable enemy, unfortunately, Masanori is gonna take a lot of damage really quickly and then get into his phase where you can't freeze him, which is annoying, but whatever, it's fine. Again, right? He just stops being freezable and you're just like, well, that sucks. Anyways, these teams are solid because the Hyperbloom core generally is just very solid to begin with, and then you can kind of put whatever. Now, putting a Cryo unit, if they're a Cryo unit that has a decent amount of damage, you're helping them that way, but also it's helping you generate more seeds, and it's very nice for the defensive utility of being able to freeze the enemies. So, I mean, we've talked about HyperFridge, but we haven't talked about just traditional Hyperbloom stuff, so let's do that. When it comes to just your normal Hyperbloom teams, where you're not trying to trigger to do QuickBloom, you're not trying to maintain Quicken uptime, you have like one main thing that you want to be doing, and that's generate as many seeds as possible. And then once you figure that out, you want to make sure that you're triggering your Hyperbloom and every time you generate seeds. So the ideal thing is going to be fast Electro, both application and just hits, fast Dendro, fast Hydro, fast everything is ideal, basically. Now, unfortunately, our units that have fast Electro, at least for off-field, struggle to consistently hit the seeds. You look at someone like Fischl, the hitbox on how she can hit the seeds is actually kind of tricky, and very often, especially if the enemies have a weird, large hitbox, or if they move a lot, you'll end up with a lot of seeds on the ground that you just can't hit because Fischl doesn't target them. Because of that, I don't like Fischl in traditional Hyperbloom teams that much. She's still good, don't get me wrong, you can still use her, but I generally prefer the other options. One thing that you can potentially like sacrifice is your fast Electro application, as long as you keep hitting the enemies quickly with Electro. Because what you can do with that is you can effectively use make sure that your Electro still is like happening at the right moment to help you abuse the Electro Charge mechanic. So I guess I should talk about the Electro Charge mechanic. When we talked about QuickBloom, we saw that Hydro onto Dendro doesn't fully remove the Dendro. The thing is, Dendro onto Hydro does. So if you apply Dendro onto Hydro, Hydro's your aura, Dendro is your trigger, you're not going to get as many seeds being generated, which isn't good for Hyperbloom. You want to get as many seeds as possible. But if you have a Dendro aura and you keep a Dendro aura, what's going to happen is it limits your options for Hydro units, because our good Hydro applicators apply a lot of Hydro. And so what's going to end up happening is you don't really have a choice. You are going to be having Hydro as an aura, or you're just going to use slow Hydro and you're not going to get that many seeds anyways. So how do you go about solving that? Well, you can use an Electro Charge mechanic, where when you apply Dendro onto Electro Charge, you get one seed, but you also trigger Quicken, and then you can use that Quicken and then apply Hydro to it to generate a second seed. Being able to do that is actually very relevant. That's letting you make it so that even if you have Hydro as an aura, even if you have Hydro on the enemy, you can still get 2 seeds per Dendro application. And so one thing that you can do is you can try to make sure that you're using a team where the enemy always has both Hydro and Electro on them right before your Dendro hits them. So this is such a team. I'm using Zhongli because he's comfortable. But yeah, effectively, you just end up using this mechanic in order to generate more seeds. And by generating more seeds, I mean, you're getting more Hyperblooms, and that's cool. Raiden is obviously not the only option in this slot. I use Raiden because she's my favorite one, but you can always use someone like Kuki, you can always use someone like Yai that still have that good off-field application. One other way to go about this is you can use 2 Electro units. Now, if you use 2 Electro units, generally, you're gonna basically make it so that your Hyperblooms are being triggered by sometimes one and sometimes the other, which means you have to build EM on both, which means, well, that kind of sucks. That's not what you want to do. If you have to build EM on both, then neither of them are doing talent damage, and then at that point, what's the point of having 2 Electros? And so, something you can do is you can use an Electro unit that doesn't hit the Cs, like Beto, like we talked about earlier. Sure, Hyperbloom is single target damage, but Bloom, it triggers 1 seed per enemy that you hit with your Bloom. And so it's not actually true single target. It still has some AoE scaling. I'm using Thundering Fury on my Ayato to have good uptime on the E. And we end up with pretty solid AoE coverage, right? You get the idea. By using Beto, you make sure that you always get the Electro Charge, or Dendro on Electro Charge mechanic, because she applies more Electro, but she doesn't yoink your seeds, and she also helps you just get better AoE damage and better AoE coverage. Which is why I like using it with Ayato instead of someone like Shinzo, because he also has really good AoE coverage. Let's move on to the next team I wanted to talk about, which is the Anemo trigger Hyperbloom stuff. So I did talk about this in my video, and this is probably the team that I've been enjoying the most, or not enjoying the most overall, but this is probably the team that I would consider to be the most versatile and strong overall out of the new Dendro teams we have.
Oh my god.
I want to kill him. But you can see, it does well in single target, but where it truly shines is in AoE situations because it's an on-field Sucrose team, obviously. But one of the things that a lot of people don't know about Hyperbloom is that it is single target, but it's not real single target. It's single target in the sense that it homes in onto one specific enemy, and the area of effect for the damage is really, really small. But it is there. There is a small area of effect for the damage, which means that if the enemies are very, very tightly grouped together, like you can actually do with on-field Sucrose, depending on what enemies you're fighting and where they start, obviously, but it is something that can be done. You can actually get your Hyperbloom to be some AoE stuff. That's not generally why the team is good. Generally, the team is just good because it's like a taser team, but on steroids. Obviously, do keep in mind that this Abyss has the, like, resistance shred on Bloom reaction damage, so that's obviously helping us, but yeah. This is a team that doesn't really have a bad matchup. It does well against everything. I mean, honestly, I should show how it does against, like, other types of enemies, so I guess I can show it on this thing, right? The biggest problem with these guys is that you kill them too fast. Then you're just left with, like, nothing. I don't have my burst.
Target practice.
It is what it is. We just wait, I guess. Come on, stop it. Would you please? Okay. Whatever. It wasn't the best, but you get the idea. You can use Kazuha in this team as well. I haven't liked it as much because when you use Kazuha, you don't get to auto attack with Anemo, which means that you actually don't get nearly as good consolidation of your seed generation, and you don't actually get your seeds in the way that you'd want to get them. Right, you very often you are going to get more than 2 seeds at the same time. In stuff like this, it's not the end of the world. It ends up showing a lot more once you get to the single target. Once you get to single target content where it struggles a bit more, but it's still very good. It's just compared to the Sucrose version, it meh. But like it's still a very solid option. Don't get me wrong. Another thing you can do is you can actually just do it with any Anemo unit that can apply a decent amount of Anemo. You can do it with Hazel, you can do it with Xiao, you can probably do it with Venti to some extent, but meh. But yeah, you actually can do it with Xiao, so I can show you guys. But yeah, as you can see, even with Xiao, it can work. And unironically, if you don't need the grouping, Xiao's actually pretty good at it because his Anemo application is like incredibly consistent, right? Because he's got like very, very fast multi-hit normal attacks. So he ends up with pretty solid application because of it. If anything, though, the most important thing about this is that it's really funny. That's all that really matters. Next up, we can talk about the Burgeon teams. So Burgeon is, in general, kind of struggles from a few of the problems that I mentioned in that video, where if you go Hydro Aura onto Dendro, you run into the issue where triggering Bloom with a Dendro trigger means that you only get 1 seed per Dendro application, unlike the 2 that you'd get per Dendro application if you get Hydro triggers. But if you go Dendro Aura Hydro trigger, that means you're going to trigger Burning, and Burning is really, really bad because you'll have Dendro on the enemy, so when you apply Pyro to them, you trigger Burning, and Burning can kind of prevent you from getting more blooms, and it's just a fucking pain in the ass. You can get good results out of like normal Burgeon teams when it comes to AoE situations, but you can get even better results when it comes to actually cheating out some of the mechanics, right? So the main 2 ways that you can do that is A, accept that that's what's gonna happen, but in exchange, try to use units that are like really, really good at it. So for example, right, a team like this, where you're basically just, you're accepting that you're gonna have to struggle with that, but so in order to like fix it, we use Xingqiu that has really, really fast Hydro application to try to still get a decent amount of blooms, and you use Kazuha as your trigger with C6 Bennett, or even without, because he can still Pyro infuse from it. And because at least you're getting grouping in a Burgeon team, so obviously when the enemies are grouped up together, you can actually get some pretty solid results. You can get some pretty solid results out of that just because you're using a unit like Kazuha to trigger all of your stuff. You get to on-field your Kazuha, which means you actually use your E every 6 seconds whenever it's available. Solid stuff. That being said, a team like this, when it comes to single target, can actually end up being a lot more underwhelming because, well, obviously you're playing a Burgeon team in single target and you're not really building your team around that weakness, which means that when you are in single target, it's kind of just like, oh, okay, I guess. Because you're still using Xingqiu, and you're using Kazuha with Xingqiu, you can still get some pretty, like, okay results, but, like, you can see that this is not... I mean, it wasn't perfect. It was far from perfect. But you can see that the kind of stuff that you can expect from this is just not quite as reliable / good as when you stick to the different Hyperbloom teams in single target. Obviously, that is to be expected, though, because this is not a good single-target team. But it is a good AoE team. Another thing that you can do is you can, instead of just accepting that those are issues and just fucking trying to make a good team anyways, you can just try to fix those issues. So I've made a video on Burgeon and how you can use Electro to solve some of the issues with Burgeon. So usually, if I trigger Burgeon and then I apply Hydro, it only vaporizes, it does not bloom. However, I got a Vaporize and a Bloom this time. So the reason why I got a Vaporize and a Bloom, because basically you use the Electro to weaken the Burning Aura, and then you could actually get through the Burning Aura to trigger Bloom with one source of Hydro. So that's one way in which Electro helps. But another way in which Electro helps is what we already talked about with the Dendro into Electro Charge mechanic that lets you generate more seeds. And then another way in which Electro helps is your Pyro unit is built for full elemental mastery because they want to do Burgeon. So when you trigger Overload with that Pyro unit, that's a decent amount of damage. And so basically what you can do is you combine all of these things together and you use an Electro unit that isn't too likely to steal too many of your seeds, like Fischl. You can also use Beto when you're in AoE. Kill him, but you get the idea, right? You use these mechanics in order to fix a lot of the problems that Burgeon has as a baseline and basically make the ceiling for your team a little bit higher. When it comes to chambers like 12-1, this kind of stuff is going to be a little bit difficult to pull off as well, because the enemies can get overloaded away because they're light enemies. But when you do pull it off, it is still quite good. Wasn't the best, but you get the idea. I guess we could also talk a little bit about the Thundering Furry team. You can use teams like this where you basically abuse those mechanics that we talked about a little bit.
Spread your wings and raise a storm! Goodbye, but we'll meet again.
And one of the best things about Dendro is that it makes teams like this good. That's, at the end of the day, that's my favorite thing about the 3.0 patch. It's that it's made so many characters that were just like kind of left behind by people like realizing how to actually play the good teams, because they've always been like worse than others, but they got left behind because they didn't have like more complicated mechanics that you could use to make them good. So people started figuring out a lot of the stuff to make the national teams good, because the national teams had a lot of stuff to make them good, the taser team, stuff like that. But units like the Razor, I mean, I guess to some extent Toma, even if he's not that old, units like Lisa generally kind of got left behind, and it's really nice to have ways to make those units actually competitive again, and I'm really happy about it. One thing about all of this is part of why it's so fresh in my memory to like talk about all these things is because 2 days ago, I think, I got my account reviewed by Mr. Xlice. He's probably gonna post it to YouTube eventually. When it is posted, I'll leave a link to it in the description / pinned comment / whatever. If you see it, if it's there, you should check it out, and if it's not there yet, you should make sure you go subscribe to him, because we talk about a lot of these teams. I think it's gonna be an incredibly good video. I would highly encourage you guys to check it out. But yeah, you should also, if you haven't already, subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, check me out on Twitch at twitch.tv/thejeff77, all that. I'm going to be releasing a lot of Nahida videos when she comes out, where I basically try her in those teams, because Nahida's gonna be good in so many different teams, and I think it's gonna be really nice to have like actual showcases that aren't just showcases, but also like explanations on the rotations, on like what makes it good, where it's good, the kind of stuff that you can expect to do, how to build them, all that. Look forward to that. Again, check out Xlice on YouTube and on Twitch. I'll leave links in the description, and yeah, I'll see you guys around. See ya.